All right, sports fans. In this video, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about Greek temples and Greek religion, and the most famous of these groupings of temples, which is called the Acropolis in Athens. First of all, let's start with the idea of Greek religion. Greek mythology is some of the most famous mythology that anybody ever studies, right? You've got a lot of different gods, and the gods are familiar with a lot of people. Zeus, Apollo, Poseidon, Hades. The words are pretty familiar. They're used by the Greeks and later used by the Romans. But here's how the Greeks thought about their gods. Their gods were kind of like superhumans. When we see statues of gods, they look human. They look like superhuman, as we said in our last lecture on the human form. They are flawed. They make mistakes. They are subject to fate, just like humans are. But they are mortal and they live forever. And they are not the type of gods that we think of in the Judeo-Christian tradition that you pray to and they help you. You worship these gods because these gods put you on earth and gave you life. And therefore, that's what they did for you. Now you worship them, right? So how did the Greeks worship? Well, the Greeks believed that the god existed wherever the god existed, like Apollo and the sun, or the Zeus and Olympus and all that stuff. That's true. But also a piece of the god lived and dwelt in a temple. And so the temples were literally the home of the gods. So if you wanted to talk to Zeus, you would go to the temple of Zeus, and you would talk to the statue of Zeus, and hopefully he would answer your prayer. Athena, the same way, Apollo, and on down the line. And so when we think about these temples, we have to think of them as houses for the actual god. They believed the god actually lived there, and when they went there, they were in a holy space where the god existed, right? And the statue was the symbol of that god. And so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we do is we break down Greek temples by period, right? And if you remember when we talked about, I'm trying to get out of the light there. Remember when we talked about the human form can be divided into three time periods: archaic, classical, and Hellenistic, right? Well, the same thing can be said by temples, and the best way to determine whether a temple fits in what period is by looking at the columns. And so if we see this column here on the left, we have what is called the drum, which is the bottom middle part of the column. At the top we have the capital, and the capital is the key to noticing what period it's from. So here's a plain round capital. That would be archaic, mostly, right? Now we get to the middle, and we have the little swirly things at the top. That's actually a scroll that has been rolled out and kind of set on top of the column as a capital, and that is going to be from the classical period. And finally, over here, we have the blooming flower at the top of the column, and that's going to be the capital of that, and that is the Hellenistic period. So archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. Now, for our purposes, this is actually a slide for our art history class. For our purposes, we're not going to get all that detailed into the parts of a temple, but it is interesting to see where the artwork would be displayed. In the earlier periods, you would have a metope, which was kind of just a plain square that they would carve a figure on in relief, meaning it's still stuck to the stone, and it would be separated by these borders that had three lines that they called a triglyph. And so when you look at archaic temples, and sometimes archaic temples that transition to classical temples, you see metopes and triglyphs. And what they have is a story running all the way around the temple, so you can walk around it on the outside and look up, and you can actually see this story taking place, the most famous of which was from the Parthenon in Athens. And we'll look at some of those metopes, right? So the top of the roof has the triangular shape, right? And the triangular shape is called the pediment. And this is going to be important to understand because when you look at different sculpture, you can determine whether or not it's a pediment sculpture or not a pediment sculpture and where it would fit inside that pediment, right? Know that the pediment is not just a flat triangle. The edge of the pediment actually went out, maybe a good 3, even 4 feet, so that actual statues in the round, 3D statues, would sit on top of the pediment. And we're going to look at some of those, okay? And so sometimes you would have, as we move on in period, you would have what we call a continuous frieze. So we get rid of the triglyphs and the metopes, and we just have a scene going all the way around the temple itself. And so you just walk around and see the scene. Usually this is not a story or a tale or a myth like you see in the archaic period. It is more a event that's like occurring. And so you see people on parade or something like that, right? Citizens of the town. Now, the Corinthian columns were toward the Hellenistic period, of course, so we see them outside of Greece a lot. These were the favorite of the Romans. The Romans would use Corinthian columns a lot. Okay, so here are, again, kind of a simple breakdown, cutaway of a temple we have the pediment, and here you can see how large the lip of the pediment is. That would allow you to just set not carved relief statues, but actual statues sitting on that lip. And then you have the metopes and the triglyphs here. You can see how you could walk around. And this is the Doric columns, right, that are from the Archaic period. And on the inner part of it, you have a continuous frieze, right? So you walk through the first row of columns looking at more of the older style, and then walk to the second level as more of the continuous frieze style. This is what you see in Athens. This is the Parthenon. The Parthenon has metope triglyphs on the outside and continuous frieze on the inside, until eventually we get to the inner, what we call the cella, or the naos. Okay, so here is the Acropolis today. And there are a lot of things I can say about the Acropolis. It's a beautiful place. It has been, it is old, and a lot of it has been falling down. If you ever have a chance to go there, it's going to be impressive, but expect to see scaffolding and metal things all over the place, just really trying to keep the building up. And so what we're looking at here is, of course, a modern-day view, but the entrance to the Acropolis would be here on this side, where people of the town or the city would weave through the streets on like a festival day, a ritual day. Everyone would go up to the Acropolis, which is here, and they would weave through these streets and weave through these temple areas here into the actual temple area, where they would see the big building, the Parthenon, but also other temples and beautiful sites around it, right? And this is what you see if you go there today. Now, remember we talked about the idea of the polis and the Acropolis in our last lecture in class, and this is what we consider to be the Acropolis, the most famous of which. So when you say Acropolis nowadays, you think Athens, right? And so you can see this is a natural rock face that they built this on, but then they built it up and put a wall around it as well. And this is all from period. This is not new that the country of Greece did. This is all was originally there. Okay, so here's what it looked like in its glory. Okay, so flip that, and you're looking at the area over here where you went inside. That's this area here. So winding around the streets of Athens, coming through this beautiful temple area here, this is called the Propylaea. The Propylaea was not necessarily a temple dedicated to a specific god or goddess, but it was a place where you'd showcase the art of Athens. And at this period of time, Pericles and the Gold Age in Athens, this is where all the great art was made. And much of that art was displayed here. So as you walked up through into the temple area proper, you would go through these beautiful sculptures and things that all the latest artists had done. And so it was somewhat of a gallery. Then you get up into this area, and you had lots of choices. There was a huge statue of Athena that kind of replicated the statue that was inside. You could walk around this area here. A lot of people went right to this area, and then eventually down here to this small temple that we'll look at called the Temple of Athena Nike. Now remember we talked about Nike. Nike is the symbol for victory or a spirit of victory, and so this temple was dedicated to that spirit. Just a tiny little temple with a great view of the city off to this side. Parthenon is there, and then we're going to talk about another building here called the Erechtheion. All three of those are still there today. Okay, so this is the Temple of Athena Nike. Of course, the top of it is gone. The pediment is not there anymore. And it was a small temple, too, so it didn't have a lot of huge pediment carvings at the top. But I'm sure it was very beautiful. We have a continuous frieze going around it, and we have the Ionic columns, which are from the classical period. And one of the things that we see in Athens, especially at the Acropolis, is that some of the buildings are built in the archaic Doric style, and some of the buildings are built in the Ionic classical style. And so what happened there? Well, since the structures took so long to build, you passed from one style to another. And so instead of tearing everything out and starting over, they just added the new style on with the old style. So you can see a combination of both when you look at temples on the Acropolis in Athens. So you got this beautiful little temple here with the thin columns. You don't need really thick columns because it's not really heavy. It doesn't have to hold up a lot of weight. You have one little naos or room in here that would have probably a little statue of the Nike. And look at the view. It's beautiful, right? Okay, so here is the scene walking up to the Acropolis itself. This is what you see nowadays. You have to imagine these stairs all finished, right? And you just walk straight up through these beautiful columns with a huge temple pediment over it, with all these beautiful structures in here. Sadly, of course, that is gone. Again, I'm a historian, so it's sad to me. And so you have these rough rocks here, so you got to weave your way through these steps, hold onto the rails, finally get up there, and look at the scaffolding. It really is just holding the place up. They're not, doing renovations or making it bigger. This place is old and has been through a lot, and so they're just trying to keep rocks from falling on your head. But just to know what it looked like and see what it is now, still pretty impressive. So this is the Propylaea. Now, once you get into the temple structure proper, then you're going to get to the Parthenon. And here's what we see, okay? This beautiful, large, massive temple here with Doric columns. You've got metopes and triglyphs running around it, and the beautiful pediment that we see on top. You have the scaffolding in the back, and then no roof, right? And so maybe the roof fell down because of time or erosion. Now, what happened is, at one point in the more modern past, there was a siege of the city of Athens, and the people inside the city decided they would have a great idea and store their gunpowder inside the temple itself. Well, the attackers made a direct hit on the temple, exploding the gunpowder and blowing the roof off the place, literally, right? So this is what it looks like today. If I could go back in time, I would stop them from doing that. Now, this is what the statue looked like on the inside of the Parthenon. You get inside the cella itself, or the naos, and you have this 40-foot statue of Athena made of gold and wood and ivory and jewels, and it was very impressive. It had to be pretty impressive to look at. And so you have Athena here, large shield there. The serpents were her servants, and so she has like a huge snake. She's got a little Nike, Athena Nike there in her hand, and so you'd walk in, and this is where she'd live. This is her home, her dwelling. So if you wanted to talk to the goddess, you would come in this darkened room with a candlelight and this huge statue and smoke and incense, and maybe chanting from the priestesses. So it was quite a moment, quite an experience if you went in there, right? So this is what was on the inside. Okay, so if you move around the Parthenon and you go to the backside, you have a temple called the Erechtheion, which was a nice little temple. But what makes this temple important is the style of columns that they used. And they weren't columns at all, they were statues. And so this is one of the first examples we see of this in the Greek world, is the idea that instead of a Doric column or a Ionic column, we put a statue column. It's called a caryatid, right? And so we have these beautiful priestesses here that are like, remember the human form that we talked about. They got one leg relaxed, one leg straight, so they're following all the rules of Polyclitus, right? They are they're moving forward in the art form of sculpting women. Remember, the archaic women were very stiff and barrel-like, and now we're getting to the more natural look, but we're still before the Venus de Milo, and so we are moving toward that. And so we have these beautiful figures here that hold up the roof itself. And this is called the Porch of the Maidens in the Erechtheion. Very unique. Okay, another view of the Porch of the Maidens here. In the art history class, I would point out some designs that you see today. We have like these little things at top, these round things and little sharp things that go all the way around the headdress. Those are, we call them egg and dart. And what's significant about them is that we sometimes see them in old homes today in crown molding around the ceiling or in other places. The egg and dart's a very popular, what we call Greek revival style, right? Okay, so there were statues on the pediment, and we think they look like this from the writings and descriptions of the art itself. We know the architects. The one thing about the Greek world, pause a little bit and mention this, that we don't see in other places is that we know the artists, right? We know the sculptors, and we know the architects and everyone who made this. In other places, we don't really, the artists aren't that important. It's done for the glory of the pharaoh, or it's done for the glory of the religion. But here the artist comes into his own and is able to sign his work or be known for his work, right? And so we have the artists that did all these sculptures and the artists that did we have their names. And so what we have here, we have two scenes, and one is the west and one is the east pediment, right? And so the one at the top, well, let's talk about the one at the bottom first, right? The one at the bottom is the birth of Athena. And if you know the myth, Zeus, of course, fate is a very big part of Greek mythology. And Zeus heard a prophecy that one of his children would give him a lot of problems or trouble, right? And so like his father, Kronos, he decided every child that he had, he would just eat them. And so therefore he wouldn't have any problems. And so the baby comes out, he swallows the baby whole, and a couple days later he has this massive headache, right? And so he can't get rid of it. So he calls the blacksmith of the god, Hephaestus, Vulcan in the Roman, right? To come up and crack his head open to see what's wrong with it. He's a god, he's not going to die. So the blacksmith of the gods comes up with a big hammer and smashes Zeus's head open. And when Zeus's head pops open, out pops Athena, fully dressed in armor and screaming. No wonder he had a headache, right? And this is that moment. There's Zeus, there's Athena, there's the blacksmith of the gods, and smashing Athena's head open. And all the gods there are like, what? And everybody's kind of turning around looking at the scene of what's going on. Now, on the other pediment, this is the story of how Athens got its name. The legend or the myth says that the god Poseidon of the sea and the god Athena were competing for to be named, for the city to be named after them. And so the contest was that they were going to give the city a gift, and the greatest gift would win the prize of having the city named. So Poseidon jumps up and gives the city a spring of water, that always is bubbling, right? But the problem is the water was salt water because he's god of the sea, so it didn't do anybody any good. Athena jumps up and gives the people a tree, a fig tree, a fruit tree, and so now they can eat the fruit. And so this was, of course, much more practical, and they chose Athena to be the winner and named their town Athens. And this is the scene there of the naming of the city. So one pediment, the other pediment, both with these stories, right? Now, if you want to see these pediments, you do not go to Greece. You go to London, England, to the British Museum. And here's why. During the imperial period, the one we'll talk about next semester probably, the British, of course, controlled a large part of the world. And the British were also in Greece. There was a man there who was over the British government in Greece, and his name was Lord Elgin. Lord Elgin went to the Acropolis and found all these statues just kind of lying around, wasting away. People were coming and taking marble out of there and burning it for lime or doing something with it. And he thought it was terrible that these statues weren't preserved. So he ordered all of them boxed up and sent back to England, where they rest now in the British Museum. The largest collection of Parthenon statues is not in Greece, it is in England, right? So you go to the British Museum and you see these pediment sculptures that are from, and I believe this is the scene from the birth of Athena, right? Here is one of the horses of Apollo or Diana coming up from out of the earth from morning or night, right? You have the god Dionysus. He probably has a glass of wine. Then you have maybe these are the three fates, and they're turning to look at the scene going on over here, which is Athena's being born, right? And so you can see how that roof would angle down, and all of these statues would have to fit in that space, right? Okay, metopes. The metopes on the Parthenon also were taken back to England, and also you can see most of them in the British Museum. Now, the metopes tell a story, and the story is of the Lapith wedding, and it goes like this. Centaurs, the mystical creatures in ancient Greece that have the body and the torso of a man and the upper body of a man and the lower body of a horse, were notoriously promiscuous. They loved women, right? So anytime they could kidnap a woman, they would. Well, they come across these couples, these young couples, getting married, right? And so they crash the wedding to try to steal the women, and so the men, of course, jump in, and they have this huge battle trying to save the women or kidnap the women, depending on who you are. And so this is one example of that square metope. You have the guy there, and he's gouging out the centaur's eye, and the centaur's got him by the throat, and they're fighting together, trying to win and keep the women. Now, notice this is a classical piece, as we talked about in our last lecture, that this is very real, kind of exaggerated with the delts and the abs and all that stuff, but also somewhat posed, like, I'm killing you, I'm going to kill you. That's not real emotion, right? So we're still solidly in the classical period here. Now, let me just say a word about the idea of art being in different places, right? The art of Greece, the Parthenon, has been in London in the British Museum for since the 1800s. The Greek government now, many times, wants it back. And so we'll call almost on a yearly basis and say, hey, can we have our stuff back? And the British Museum says, oh, sorry, wrong number, and they hang up, right? And so the controversy here is, should it be given back to Greece? The issue, of course, is not, does art belong in the place where it originated? The issue is, can art be preserved in that place, right? That's the most important thing. Can we be preserved for later generations to come and enjoy it? And if you are up to it, Greece has had some issues economically recently, and the British could make the argument that, the first thing to go when you have economic problems is funding for the arts. Museums and restorations and preservations of historic objects kind of go out the window when you're trying to feed people. But Greece has, in the past couple of years, created a beautiful museum around the Parthenon, and they still have some of their statues and some of their metopes and artwork left. And so they want it back. They have a space for it, but the British Museum doesn't want to give it back. And we have to look at it from the British side. If they were to give this stuff back, then they wouldn't really have a lot left in the museum. You know, this is one of the crown jewels of what they have. They've got a lot of other stuff, but this is big. People go to the British Museum to see the Elgin marbles. And so it's a modern day controversy that we still haven't solved yet. So anyway, so that's the basics of the temple, the Acropolis. Remember when we talked about Pericles in class, Pericles built all of that. He funded all of it. And it was very expensive. I think I read somewhere that in the first year, the construction of marble and moving the marble and hiring the artists and just the workers was like in today's money, like $1 billion. And so he spent tons of money on this beautiful artwork. But it was a way for him to glorify Athens. And we said that was one of his motivations for being the leader of Athens. He wanted to glorify Athens, to strengthen the Athenian Empire and strengthen the democracy. So the glorification of Athens was all wrapped up in this artwork that he created, this beautiful artwork. And it worked, right? People would come in the ancient world. They would come from all over Greece and all over the world just to see the beautiful statues and sculptures and buildings that Pericles was able to erect there at the Parthenon. Okay, so the labor of love of Pericles is what the Acropolis was, right? Okay, so stay tuned for the next one, and let me know if you have any questions.